Here is Sailor Texas, a brown ink. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion on this ink.
The paper I'm using here is a Maruman Mnemosyne Notebook.
This brown is certainly interesting. As a brown, it gives me a kind of gun leather impression, especially from the broad nib. So yes, there is some tone variation by pen, and in the wet fine, it is odd to me. It does shade, and it comes through on cheaper paper. So yes, it also performs well on most of the non-fountain pen friendly paper, except of course 20-pound copy paper. I like brown inks, yet this felt a bit off somehow. This leaves me feeling it was rushed, since it isn't really for that Asian market, and it feels like it's kind of a cash grab in a theme.
All of the writing samples are done with a Platinum 3776 with a soft fine nib that writes rather dry, a Hero 7035 with a fine nib that writes wet, a Visconti Van Gogh with a medium nib and an average flow, a Lamy All-Star with a broad nib that writes average.
The pen for today is a Pilot Metropolitan.
Now that we know my opinion on this ink, let's see how I got there with the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get a beautiful lighter tone, not too light where you can't read it. Now, it does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade extremely well, not as well as some of the other brown inks I've seen, but it still does very well. Look, it's still on the second line. The top of the S is lighter than the bottom of the S, where it gets very dark into that T. Then the IL become a nice mid-tone, the last L very dark again. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade. Now I'm going to draw attention to Mr. Baggins at the top, where it is the darkest. And to me in person, it's coming across as a unusual kind of red magenta-ish kind of tone with brown, and it's just, it feels odd in what's happening, and it's not really my favorite in what's happening. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was from the wet fine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade very well. A real treasure in what's happening when we look at treasure on the second line, where the T is dark, the R lightens up quite a bit. The E becomes very dark into the A, where it starts lightening a bit from the A to the S, but it gets much darker on the shore at the end. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, the same tone as the soft fine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It shades very well. Perhaps shading a little better than it did with the soft fine nib, just for having those thicker lines to really be able to see it. We're getting a great showing of this sort of gun leather brown that I had mentioned, but on the first line, but the top of the B is lighter than the bottom of the B, really nice ombre effect into it. It stays dark at the bottom of the B, but the U lightens ever so slightly and then gets darker again at the T. Looking at the back of the page, we get no bleeding and no ghosting.
Like most inks, this one comes in a bottle. This is how the Pilot Custom 823 fits. And here is the Pelican M1000. Here is the ink level when you can no longer fill a Lamy Safari. There is approximately 7 milliliters of ink left. The next writing sample is done in a Portage Reporter's Notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade fairly well, really killing it. Look at killing on the second line, where the beginning of the K is very dark. The I lightens up a little bit. The first L lightens up a little bit more, but the ling at the end gets very dark. Probably not the best word to have chosen, but I was able to work it in better than smog. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does have some shading, but it's largely very dark and it's harder to really see it like on the second line, where the L is very dark. It lightens up a little bit into the I and beginning of the K and then becomes very dark again. Was almost underneath that, starts a little lighter on the W and darkens a bit at the as at the end. Looking at the medium nib, it is the same tone as the wet fine, darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade better than it did with the wet fine, really standing out though on the second line, though, where the T is a little lighter than the H. It lightens up quite a bit into the OUG, but the H at the end, quite a bit darker. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, the same tone as the soft fine, same tone as the Clairefontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade very well, I spies with my little eyes on the first line. The S is light. Now that P goes to a darker mid-tone, lightens into the I, very dark with the ES at the end. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding, no ghosting, and no problems.
There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The one on the left is immediately put into water for 10 to 15 seconds. The one on the right, marked with a D, is let dry for 10 minutes before putting into water. The next writing sample is done on a national brand Steno notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, this is the same tone that we got from the Clairefontaine, meaning this is a rather opaque ink, not being affected by the tone of the paper. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does shade better than it did on the Clairefontaine, so a slight effect of the paper in that the shading really does come through even better here. And you don't have to wait a fortnight to see it. See how clever I worked that in? Fortnight on the second line, where the F is darker than the O and the RT darken up a bit. The NIG lighten, the H a little darker, and the T quite a bit darker at the end. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairefontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it barely shades. There's almost none of it that really goes down. Take a look at down on the second or third line, middle of the page. The DO is very dark and the WN at the end, quite a bit lighter. Looking at the medium nib, it is just a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine. Little bit lighter than it was on the Clairefontaine. No, same tone. I was looking at the wrong thing. Same tone as the Clairefontaine. It doesn't feather. It doesn't spread. It does shade, though I think the shading came through better on the Clairefontaine than it does here. Not mountains of shading, but there is some. Look at mountain on the third line, where the M is a little bit darker than the OUN. It's the top of the T that gets quite a bit darker. It lightens into the A and much darker on the IN at the end. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, the same tone as the soft fine, the same tone as the Clairefontaine. Now, I see just a tiny bit of feathering occurring with little on the TL on the first line. I see a little bit of feather on frightened on the second line. If on the third line, tiny feathers are occurring, not common for this paper, though we have seen it a few times. No real spread. Yes, it is obviously shading fairly well. Look at frightened on the second line, where the F does a whole lot of shifting back and forth between all those colors. Now the RI are a bit lighter than that, and the GHT start to darken. The ENED at the end, quite a bit darker. Looking at the back of the page, we have no problem with bleeding or ghosting because they're not really there.
Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. The smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. The highlighter is on the top left, pen flush is on the top right, 1/3 bleach solution is on the bottom left, and water is on the bottom right. The next writing sample is done in a Rhodia notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine. It does stand out against the quad rule and not get lost in the background, making this good to use on quad rule paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is a whole lot darker than it was with the soft fine. A little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it barely shades. It's really showing off a lot of that kind of red magenta lean, and I am not caring for what I see. Looking at the medium nib, it is a little bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather, it does not spread, it does shade. The shading is back. And knowing that it's back, we'll look at knowing where there's not nearly as much. The N is a lighter tone, the K is a lighter tone. The N lightens up a little bit. The OWIN lighten again. The G becomes a bit darker. Not that it doesn't shade when we see not underneath it, where the N is a nice mid-tone. The O lightens up a little bit, and the T gets quite a bit darker. So I wouldn't dare say that there's none. Look at dare in the amount of shifting of colors in the D at the very beginning. Looking at the broad nib, it is lighter than it was with the medium, the same tone as the soft fine, same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it does shade just as well as it did on the Clairfontaine, but I am noticing, like on Master, the vertical lines seem to be cutting the ink just a little bit, but it doesn't always do that because it didn't do it on the Inexpensive, but it does do it occasionally, like Let on the second line. So it does sometimes have problems with crossing those vertical lines and breaking up some. Looking at the back of the page, no bleeding and no ghosting.
With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables.
Here is Ackerman, their number 23. Here is Birmingham Pen Company Steel Tower Smoked Iron. Here is Blackstone Brown Baronia. Here is Caran d'Ache Organic Brown.
The next writing sample is done in a composition lab notebook.
Looking at the soft fine nib, it is the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It doesn't feather, it doesn't spread, it shades just as well as the Clairfontaine. It stands out against the quad rule. It is doing an amazing job. Now, it is obviously not super dark in what's happening, but you can easily read it. Would I think this is the primary color for someone to use here? No, but as a secondary color, it would do amazing on this paper. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread and it does shade. It does stand out on the quad rule. I'm really surprised by how well it's shading on here because this is not something that picks up a lot of shading. Now, something odd that did happen while I was writing is you'll notice that at the end of the second line and after that, it did shift to being a little bit darker in tone. Looking at the medium nib, it is a bit lighter than it was with the wet fine, lighter than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does still shade. On this paper right now, I think this is the nicest one that we're really getting. This is absolutely beautiful. And if you're a student note taker, this with a medium nib on this paper, truly outstanding. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the soft fine, the same tone as the Clairfontaine. It does not feather and it does not spread. It does stand out against the quad rule. It does not break up when crossing those vertical lines, showing that it's able to penetrate there, and it doesn't give your writing a sort of choppy look that makes it look kind of nasty. It keeps a beautiful look the whole way through. Looking at the back of the page, we have no bleeding and no ghosting.
While it's nice to see ink in the same color family, I prefer to see ink to complement the color on the page.
Here is Caran d'Ache Divine Pink. Here is Diamine Safari. Here is Pelican Mandarin. Here is Califolio Bacal.
The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper.
Looking at the soft fine nib, we get the same tone as the Clairfontaine. Now it does feather and it does spread. It does have shading, but the feathering and the spreading really just make me feel out of place with it. Look at place on the second line. You'll see exactly what I'm talking about with the appointed problems, like appointed on the second line. Not the best match to me here. Looking at the wet fine nib, it is quite a bit darker than it was with the soft fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather like a woolly mammoth, if woolly mammoths were feathery mammoths. It does spread to about a medium. It does have a couple of moments of shading, but it does make me get the ick when looking at it. Looking at the medium nib, it is lighter than it was with the wet fine, a little bit darker than it was on the Clairfontaine. It does feather and it does spread. Now, the feathering's a little out of control when you look at splashed on the second line and lake on the third line. Maybe it doesn't like water-based words. Perhaps that's the problem. The spread is there, not as bad as it was with the wet fine. Still have kind of the ick. Looking at the broad nib, it is the same tone as the soft fine, the same tone as most of the Clairfontaine. It feathers ridiculously. It spreads most definitely. It shades, you can spot one or two areas that it did it. It really, really does not like going onto this paper from a broad nib. Avoid it if at all possible. Looking at the back of the page, you can see how deep this ink really did get into the paper. There's no taking notes on the back of this page because you'll destroy both sides, but nothing bled through touching the page underneath.
So what nib and pen do I think are going to give the best writing experience with this ink?
The paper I'm using here is yellow Rhodia paper.
The soft fine is the lightest tone and shades a ton and is easy to read on the page. The wet fine is the darkest, but the dark part of the shading, it almost has a distinctive reddish magenta lean. The medium was just as dark as the wet fine, but didn't have that reddish lean to the dark parts of the shading. Now the broad gives the same tone as the soft fine, and the shading just as well, showing the color a bit better because of those thicker lines. Now, I would say, based on the experience from the soft fine and the broad, that a drier pen will really deliver on the best tone and shading from this ink, and I would avoid it in wet pens because I just didn't care for that reddish tone that can come through in the darkest areas.
I hope you got something out of this video, and thanks for watching. I want to let you know that the best way you can support this or any channel is to let retailers know where you heard of something if you go to buy.